What would you say would be one of the key points or key marks of, a Ruthenian or a Byzantine or generally a Greek Catholic theology from your perspective as a seminary professor? If you could sum it up in a couple of sentences, what would you say is like the hallmark of difference between Byzantine Catholic, theology and Latin Catholic theology?
Yeah, let me stay in my world. I'm not going to go I think theology is one, but I'm not going to kind of focus on the dogmatic side. But in moral theology, ultimately the tone of, or like the mode of thought in Latin Catholic moral theology is ultimately kind of analytical and scientific. And this is setting aside the problem of like probabilism and kind of the legalism that broke out from the 17th century onward.
The manual tradition where your morality was taught basically under the 10 Commandments out of a textbook manual of how do we avoid sin, basically.
Yep, exactly. So like setting that aside is sort of it was a period they went through, so we're not going to cast too much of aspersions on it, but it was a bit of an aberration even with their own tradition. I would think that, and this is the problem, the Ruthenian Church doesn't have. The Ruthenian Church doesn't have a history of theologians. Even like we're poorer and smaller than you Ukrainians are.
Yeah.
But to the degree that we can kind of meld this together across some of the jurisdictional lines, the sui juris church lines, and sort of see us as at least a reflection of that, that in the end, our moral theology is much more interested in the end in sort of making connections to the ascetical writings. Like, just to use an example that that folks would be more familiar with, would be the sort of monastic texts that you find kind of classic examples of in like those first volume or two of the Philokalia, the collection of, monastic texts. But you could do this for anything that's coming out of the Egyptian sort of tradition. Or also then what would come to be termed spiritual theology. Like there's a sense in the Latin West in which ascetical theology and spiritual theology are these sort of natural blooms of moral theology, but it never quite functions that way because it's so worried about sort of the analytical relationship of, conclusions and principles. I mean, it works in a scientific mode, whereas, connection to sort of the great spiritual authors more organically, I think is a great example of, for whatever reason, like that's just the mode that comes from a somewhat more patristic outlook, from an outlook that didn't have the craze over science that the West did, right? That thought never went through that period from the 13th century onward, where Aristotle comes back into the West, and then that develops eventually into modern science, and then eventually becomes really perverted even in theology into kind of theological rationalism. It's not wrong to see theological rationalism in the West. The Orthodox are right to see that. The reason it looks so unfamiliar is that the Byzantine East never, for historical reasons, went through that same kind of craze of the modern period. But of course, that doesn't mean that this is where sometimes a kind of overly simplistic view of a kind of patristic resource misses something. However, we live in a world that in the end, the whole world has been affected by what happened in the West. And so we have to be able to interact with it. And so I guess the other side of a kind of Byzantine Catholic theology is that it realizes sometimes we have to speak not speak in both idioms, but we really do have to understand both idioms and shift between them and translate them to each other.
And part of that is because so much of our theological heritage was preserved and developed during its time in Orthodoxy. And there's so much of it that is Catholic, but it comes from a completely different jargon system. It comes in a completely different mode of thought and methodology as far as sources and approaches compared to more of the later West. Would that be kind of a simple way of, that identity struggle issue?
Yeah, you know what? And there's something here that is different between the two of us because you're Ukrainian. You see, our church, our sui juris church, is entirely in America. The Ruthenian Metropolitan Church of Pittsburgh. So we're almost, and I think it's not unimportant. So it's like, first of all, you get the problem that, Mukachevo, so they're coming from Western Ukraine. I mean, we're poor and we don't have a kind of long tradition except what's going to be the leftovers of Orthodoxy that comes to the time of the reunion at Brecht. But our own place here in America is to be the minority church. And that doesn't mean like we should be like this, the amphibian thing, right? It's like the church breathing with both lungs, which is already a problematic metaphor because actually there are different traditions that are not just, right? Eastern churches are not all the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can't be amphibian.
We're not like the way that modern Americans like to, are you Latino or non-Latino? It's like, what are you talking about?
Exactly.
It's like,